Welcome, everyone, to the National Center on Advancing Person-Centered Practices and Systems webinar presentation for today, July 9th, 2019. Today, we are going to be presenting the first webinar, first official webinar as part of our webinar series as part of the NCAPS project. I am going to be kicking us off. My name is Alex Bonardi. I am one of the co-directors of this center. To get us started, we want to provide a little bit of information about the National Center on Advancing Person-Centered Practices and Systems. This center, funded jointly by the Administration on Community Living and Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, has a goal of promoting systems change that makes person-centered principles not just an aspiration, but a reality in the lives across the lifespan. I will move us along to an overview of today's webinar so that we can quickly get into the content. I'm joined here today, for those of you who have video open, by my colleague Bevan Croft, sitting next to me, and we will be introducing our panelists in just a minute. To get started, Bevan is going to run through a few of the logistics for this webinar.
Great. Well, welcome everyone. We're so excited to be kicking off our monthly NCAPS webinar series with this webinar looking at the role of culture in person-centered thinking, planning, and practice. A few technical details before we dive in. There are many participants in this webinar, and therefore everyone is muted, and we're going to be relying on the chat feature in Zoom to post questions and also to communicate with webinar organizers. So if you type a question into chat, we will do our best to get back to you. If it's a logistical type question, then Melissa Burnett, who is also Sabrina Jonikin at HSRI, will do her best to support you in terms of getting your sound up or finding whatever you need to find to make sure that you're connected. And if you have questions for the presenters about the content of the webinar that you'd like to have covered during the question and answer portion at the end of the presentation, then go ahead and enter those into chat as well. And I'll be keeping an eye on those questions and calling out questions to be asking to our panelists. You can find your chat by going positioning your mouse down to the bottom of the Zoom window, and a chat button should pop up, and there'll be a separate window that'll come up. And just so everyone knows also, we have it set up so this is an open chat, so folks are welcome to interact with one another. When we checked registration yesterday for this webinar, there were well over 1,000 people registered, so there are lots of you on. Feel free to engage with one another to share any links or resources that you find relevant, et cetera, on that chat. And like I said, I will be monitoring that as we go as well. Let's see, this webinar is being recorded. All NCAPS webinars are recorded, and they will be archived on the NCAPS website, ncaps.acl.gov. We'll have those up within 2 weeks. We will also put up a PDF version of the slides, as well as an accessible plain language summary of the meeting for folks to have, so that people can access the materials later on. And if there are way too many questions in the Q&A for us to get to in the 15 minutes or so that we have allotted for Q&A, we'll also post a document that sort of outlines the questions and our panelists' answers to those questions on the website as well. So stay tuned for those. This webinar is being live captioned in Spanish, and to access the Spanish captions, you'll need to click on that link that's on the slides now, and I believe that link is also in your chat box. Melissa Burnett will have has pasted that in as well if you need Spanish language translation. We also have arranged for English language captioning of this webinar, and if it isn't up and running now, we are looking to get that up and running ASAP. So stay tuned on that. This is meant to be an interactive webinar, so we have built in a series of polling questions so that we can get to know you all a little bit more, and our panelists will be interacting with you that way. We have also arranged for a real-time evaluation to occur in the last couple of minutes of the webinar. So at the very end of the webinar, when we're finished with the Q&A, we'll leave a couple of minutes, and there's a 7-question sort of evaluation poll for you all to take. The questions will not be made public to other attendees, but we are hoping that you will stick around and fill out that quick evaluation so that we can see what you thought about this webinar and use the information to improve our webinars going forward. This is our first webinar, so we are certainly looking for feedback. And finally, any follow-up questions, additional feedback, communications, you're welcome to send to our email, ncaps@acl.hhs.gov. And also, if you're not already subscribed to our mailing list that lets people know about webinars, learning collaboratives, NCAPS news, then please do send an email to ncaps@acl.hhs.gov with subscribe in the subject line, and we'll get you added to that. So that said, I am going to introduce our esteemed panel. Our first presenter is Professor Tawara Goode. She is director of the Georgetown University Center for Excellence in Developmental Disabilities and is director of the National Center for Cultural Competence at Georgetown University. The mission of NCCC is to increase the capacity of healthcare and mental health care programs to design, implement, and evaluate culturally and linguistically competent service delivery systems to address growing diversity, persistent disparities, and promote health and mental health equity. We are also joined by Andy Arias. Andy has worked as a systems change advocate and program manager for Orange County and Los Angeles for over 7 years. He is a member of many boards and commissions related to creating greater visibility and advancement for diverse communities, especially the disability community. Andy's experience extends to federal government and corporate levels, and his goal is to marry his policy work with his work in the entertainment industry to create a systemic, lasting change. And finally, we're pleased to have Chaku Mathai. He's an Indian American born in Kuwait who became involved in mental health and addiction recovery advocacy when he was only 15 years old. Chaku's personal experiences with racism and xenophobia related trauma, suicide, and disabling mental health and substance use challenges as a youth and young adult launched him and his family towards a number of efforts to advocate for alternative supports, equity, and inclusion in the community. We're just so pleased to have these speakers here discussing this critical topic. So welcome all, and I will turn things over to Professor Goode.
And I'm going to pass on the control to Tawara right now.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to kick off this great webinar series. We are pleased to partner with NCAPS in the implementation of this project. We have a lot to cover in a short amount of time, and we're going to go ahead and get started. I entitled this Pieces of the Same Puzzle, the Role of Culture in Person-Centered Thinking, Planning, and Practice. So what we'll do today, we're going to spend some time talking about the evolution of person-centeredness. We will define and take a deep dive. Ooh, not sure why that happened. It's moving on its own. Okay, I'm trying to go back and it's not letting me. Okay, great. Yes, we're going to define and take a deep dive into the multiple dimensions of culture and cultural diversity. We'll really look in depth at the role of culture in person-centered thinking, planning, and practice. And as indicated by Bevan, we will draw upon the lived experiences of two people, Andy and Chaku, about cultural identities, issues of intersectionality, and really thinking about this within the context of person-centered thinking. Okay. So it is advancing. All right. So when we think about person-centeredness, the reason I'm taking you back just a little bit is that we can really look at, say, for instance, cultural competence and person-centered thinking and planning really evolving along parallel tracks. So we know that the earliest work as it relates to person-centeredness has been around a while. It was first documented in 1979. And we would look at the formative period through 1992. We know also that developmental disabilities was the original focus of this work, and that Michael Small, many of you are familiar with that name, is considered a pioneer in the area of person-centered thinking and practice and planning and developmental disabilities. And he made this debut around the mid-1980s. We also know, in terms of looking at the literature, that there are many, many definitions of person-centered thinking, planning, and practice. And there are many different approaches, and those are often really immersed in whether or not it's in the area of disability, whether or not we see it in mental health, but you will see that there are some differences. The common factor that we see across all is that the person is at the center. And across all of these approaches to person-centered thinking, planning, and practice, a common thread is the ultimate control and decisions and all aspects of a person's life is really with the person and or those closest to the person. And it's also based on what is important to and for the person. So these are common threads that we see. I'm going to just share with you an interpretation of person-centered thinking and services and supports. And this is based on, again, the work of Michael Small. So as he thought about this whole arena in terms of person-centered thinking and what that might look like in terms of the new CMS rules as it relates to person-centered thinking and planning and practice, as again, the person is at the center. And he had these 5 areas that the person chooses who supports him, her, or they. The person chooses where he, she, or they live. The person also chooses with whom they live, what she, he, or they do with their time. And the person certainly chooses how she, he, or they would spend their resources. So again, this is the common threads as we think about person-centered thinking and planning. As we look at the NCAPs, they put forth specific definitions of person-centered thinking. You can access this on their website. So again, NCAPs is looking at person-centered thinking as requiring consistency in language, values, and actions, respect and views to person or loved ones as experts in their own lives, equally emphasizes quality of life, well-being, and informed choice. In terms of person-centered planning, it's looking at that as a methodology. And again, it's the person identifies and addresses preferences and interests, making up their desired life and supports. And this is with paid and unpaid support. And again, looking at person-centered practices, this is alignment of service and systems to ensure that the person has access to the full benefits. So again, as we think about this whole notion of person-centered thinking, planning, and practices, there are different ways in which they are expressed. ACL has considered a lot as it relates to person-centered planning, and not necessarily differentiating person-centered thinking and person-centered practices. And so, again, what's important are that these definitions align to some extent, and they differ to some extent. Again, with ACL, most important, it is a process that is directed by the person who receives support. And there's a whole range of things that are indeed considered in this definition, including emergency planning, overall, transportation, friendships, therapies, treatments, etc. Why we wanted to emphasize ACL's definition, it also speaks to the unique factors such as culture and language are also addressed. Now, that is one sentence in this whole definition. And so again, as we talk about this person-centered thinking, planning, and practices, and cultural competence and linguistic competence, they have tended to evolve along separate tracks. And so as we look at, from those definitions, what's missing, well, at least what we feel is missing, is a major piece of the puzzle, and that is culture and also language, because culture and language are intricately linked. And so we're going to spend some time now really looking at culture and the multiple dimensions of culture and putting the pieces of the puzzle together that would indeed include culture. I'm going to offer several definitions of culture. I'd like for you, as you listen to this, is to really think about the extent to which these definitions and these frameworks really apply to the work that you do in your various settings. And so as we look at culture, this is a definition of culture that we use at the National Center for Cultural Competence. And this definition tells us that culture is learned. And that's so key and critical, because just as culture is learned, and we teach culture to children when they're first born, we teach them what it means to be a member of the family. We teach them gender roles. We teach them language. We teach them what it means to be part of a particular community. And so as we think about culture as learned, sometimes culture needs to be unlearned, and that many systems that are serving individuals who are aging, who have disabilities, who have mental health needs, have a culture that may not be conducive to indeed addressing the culture and language of all the populations in the United States as territories, and also in tribal communities. And so as we think about culture, as listed here, it includes all the things that you see in the ovals: relationships, behaviors, communications, thought, many others that simply could not fit on this page. What's important about culture is we know that culture applies to all people. We're all cultural beings. So it applies to a racial group, ethnic group, religious group, a political group, a professional group, a social group. So we think about the recent victory of the U.S. soccer team, men and women, a sports group, athletic group, so that culture applies to all of those groups. We know that culture is transmitted from generation to generation, and there are many aspects of culture that remain the same. However, culture is also constantly changing, and we can see that just simply in technology and getting ready for this Zoom webinar today. Again, a culture is applicable to all of us. I think this is really important, that we, despite our racial and ethnic identities, are all cultural beings. We know that culture is multi-layered. It exists at conscious and unconscious levels. It really does provide the identity for all of us, and it permeates every aspect of life. And so again, I want us to think about culture really very broadly and not simply think about race and ethnicity. Another way to think about culture, and again, we're taking this deep dive, is that culture is really about reality, how people interact with each other, how they respond to social and material environments. And I want you, again, to think about those individuals that may be in long-term care facilities versus those individuals who may live in community-based settings with their families, or in group home or other settings. We know that culture is indeed reflected in our religion and spirituality. It reflects how we work, how we parent, how we love, marry. It really impacts how we understand mental health, wellness, illness, and disability, and end of life, so that culture permeates every aspect of this. This is one of my favorite quotes. It's from the work of Linton Hansen, and it's another way for us to think about culture. This is basically saying that we technically, or not necessarily technically, but we tend to see things through our own lens. And that's, again, our own cultural lens. However, as we think about cultural competence, and that's something that we'll, in an upcoming webinar, we will go into greater detail, is that when we think about cultural competence, that is about being able to see not only ourselves, but also to be able to see through the other side of the glass. And that means being able to see things from a perspective other than our own. While it's very easy for me to say, I will share with you, I think it's something that's very, very difficult to continuously do when we're serving individuals, families, and populations. This is another concept of culture. We'll call it the iceberg concept of culture. And you'll have to excuse the way it looks. I I drew it, so that's why it doesn't look so great. We think about also culture in terms of an iceberg, and the line that's going across the top is the waterline. And as we think about, again, the iceberg, we only see about 1/10 of what's above the waterline. And many times people focus on how someone dresses, their gender, in terms of their race or ethnicity or their physical characteristics, and they think they might know something about the individual. When we think about the work as it relates to person-centered thinking, planning, and practice, is that there are so many things that are below the waterline that are not readily visible, that really tells us who a person may be, how a person may believe and act. And those are the kinds of things that we need to think about as it relates to person-centered thinking, planning, and practice in terms of guiding our work. Some of you may be familiar with this. A colleague of mine, Vivian Jackson, shared this with us, and we've been using it ever since. And this is from the work of Pamela Hayes, and it's called the addressing model. And it's a way to really think about diversity and the cultural differences among individuals and populations that you may serve. So it includes age and disability, and it differentiates disability from congenital, as in born with a disability, or acquired disability. The original model speaks to religion. We included spirituality or no affiliation, because everyone may or may not embrace religious beliefs. The author on here talks about ethnicity, which is the correct term. However, we know that in this country, race is a huge issue. We know that race is a social construct that was created that really divides and separates people on physical characteristics. And so that we have to acknowledge race, although ethnicity is the appropriate term. It looks at socioeconomic status or class, sexual orientation, indigenous heritage, national origin, and also gender. We included gender identity and expression. We think that that is really key and critical. And so we're going to go now to a polling question. And it should appear on your screen. And it's really going to ask you, in terms of your own capacity, how much of, to the extent to which you use any of the elements of addressing in terms of the work you do with and on behalf of individuals and families. And so what you will, can do on your screen, since there are 10 items, is to scroll down, and you'll be able to see all of the items. So we're going to ask you to please respond. And we will display that on the screen.
We're allowing just a few minutes, well, a short time, a few more seconds for people to scroll down, because there are a number of questions that people need to read and respond to.
And while people are responding, I'll just add that English captioning is now available. And if you haven't figured out how to access it yet, you just want to hover your mouse towards the bottom of the Zoom window or the bottom of your screen, and you should be able to select CC, closed captioning, and then the English captioning will appear at the bottom of your screen. And apologies for the delay in giving that captioning up.
Okay, Sabrina, I think we can probably close the poll. We should be about ready for that.
Okay, so I'm just going to share with you some of the findings. For age, we see that the great majority deal with age most of the time. In terms of disability congenital, that 65% of folks deal with it. Some folks indicated never. For disability acquired, most of the time, in terms of 58%, others some of the time. Religion or spirituality or no, Now, it does, in mine, say no affiliation. There is an error here on this screen that says no affliction, but the original one says no affiliation. We see that not, we have most of the time at 17%, some of the time and seldom. So that's something for us to consider, since religion may be very important to many people. Race and ethnicity, 35% of the time, most of the time, some of the time, seldom and never are some of the responses. National origin, some of the time and seldom would be the greatest percentage. Social status, some of the time and seldom. Sexual orientation, some of the time and seldom. 21% said never. Indigenous heritage, some of the time, seldom, never. And gender, and that would include gender identity and expression, 38%, but some of the time, seldom and never. I'm gonna ask that you close the poll now. Okay, so as we look at those elements of addressing, there's great variety, great array of how individuals may indeed respond to these areas. So I'm going to go on to the next one. Next slide. Okay. I am pushing and it is not advancing. Okay, organizational culture. So far we've talked a little bit about culture, looking at it again in its multiple dimensions, and we are looking at now organizational culture, because it is difficult to really think only about individuals and populations without thinking about the culture of organizations. And again, looking at aging community, looking at behavioral and mental health, looking at disability, all serving people, but all very different, from the public sector to the private sector. And so as we think about culture, we also need to think about the culture of organizations. I'm going to advance the next slide. Okay. All right. So I thought that I would share with you this convergence of cultural context that you see. And in the middle, there is, for you to consider, it's the person who may be receiving services and support. I want you to really think about that person, their culture, multiple cultural identities. Say, for instance, that person has a disability and is the only person in the family has a disability. There are many things that that person may share with their family, but not necessarily that aspect of their culture. And then we also think about the cultural context of the surrounding community for the person, family, how they are embedded within that community, how they're accepted. The next level looks at social, cultural, and economic and political issues that may affect the community, the family, and person. And so that those are all social, cultural contexts that we have to be aware of. In the outer circle, it really does look at the various cultures of the systems that individuals may need to access for care. The healthcare system, the mental health care system, advocacy services, the employment sector, housing, long-term care, independent living, legal services. And as you look at that outer ring, each of those systems of services and supports has its own culture. And quite frankly, has multiple cultures that may be layered in it. And what's important about this particular framework is to think that a person may need to access, say, 4 or 5 of these services. And each time the person and or his or her family or their family would need to actually enter into, it feels like a different culture. So that if we look at that definition that we had of culture, different rules, different language, different ways to sign on for services, so that they are experiencing these multiple cultures just trying to access services and support. And so again, I want to emphasize that culture doesn't rest only with individuals and populations. It's inherent and embedded in the work that we do. All right. Multiple cultural identities. This is another factor that's really very important. If you look at the literature, there are three ways that we think about multiple cultural identities. Because we all, again, have not just one identity, but multiple cultural identities. However, there are some people who may identify with one cultural group over all others. There are others who maintain multiple separate identities within themselves. However, when they're seeking services, they may not indeed feel comfortable sharing some of those identities with service providers. So they compartmentalize, they keep those things to themselves. And then lastly, there's a whole concept of integration, where there are many, many cultural identities and that they're integrated on a consistent basis within that particular individual. These are important, and we're going to hear a little bit more from Andy and also Chaco as it relates to this. Next one about culture is looking at intersectionality, and this is based on the work of Kimberly Crenshaw. What's important about this is that we've been hearing the term intersectionality a lot. I'd like for you to really think about how the term was originally expressed and how it was intended to be used. Kimberly Crenshaw really wrote as it relates to women, and specifically Black women, and really talked about their experiences of oppression, domination, and discrimination because of their multiple memberships in these two groups. We know that as this term has become more popular, more groups have indeed adapted it, including those within academia, human services, and social services, that intersectionality has been used in a variety of ways. We want to really bring you back to the original concept for you to really think about what does this mean in terms of the people that you serve. As many may belong to marginalized groups and that they may experience intersectionality just because of their memberships in those various groups. So someone could have a disability, also be gay, perhaps self-identifies as African American, and again, all of those will impact their experience with care and support. So we're going to hear more from Andy and also Chaco in terms of this in this area. So we have another polling question, and that is for you to think about multiple cultural identities as was described, and also intersectionality, and for you to indicate in the polling question, if you we'll raise that question up, how familiar are you with multiple cultural identities and intersectionality of the people that you serve and their families? We can have the polling question. Thank you.
We're just working on getting that up. There you are.
So this one's less complicated. We ask you to just check one response.
Okay, I think with the one response, you can probably close the polling question now and see the results.
All right, so we have about 9% not familiar at all, 22% slightly familiar, 32% somewhat familiar, moderately familiar at 28%, and extremely familiar at 9%. Thank you so much for responding to that. So again, it helps us to think about culture in a very deep and rich way. And what are we thinking about in terms of culture as it relates to person-centered thinking, planning, and processes? I'm going to close this now, and we'll go to the next slide. So this is a summary slide. We want you to really think about having a solid appreciation for and understanding of culture. And this is something that you would acquire over periods of time. And to understand the culture of others as well as your own on your road to cultural and linguistic competence. All right. we are clicking. So with this, we are going to hear from Andy and Chaku. And I have a couple questions for them. And I'm going to pose to Andy first. I know he's at an airport and waiting for a flight. So I'm going to, again, ask each of you to please share with the audience your perspective on any of the concepts that we presented about culture, about what culture is, about multiple cultural identities, including your own, and intersectionality. And from your experience, how do you think that they relate to person-centered thinking, planning, and practice? So Andy, it's your turn.
Hello, this is Andy. Hello, everyone. I'm going to try to share my face for you a minute. So I identify as an LGBTQ Hispanic male that also uses a wheelchair. And so for me, it's been part of my life's work to make sure that when I roll into a room, not just enter a room, but when I roll into a room, all my identities are respected and valued at that level, so I don't have to choose between one or the other. I feel like right now I'm still at the point where I have to choose: am I going to be LGBTQ? Am I going to be Hispanic? Am I going to be the person with the disability? There isn't that space yet. I say yet with a hopeful voice, to say that there isn't that space for us to really have true intersectionality within our work. I feel like we use the term intersectionality as the sexy term in a lot of our work, and we say it's really important to have that. But when we look at the entire person, in my experience, it's been not valued as much as I think it should be. So I'll give you a few examples. When I was first looking to acquire a vehicle or rent an apartment, I always took my Caucasian counterpart male friend with me, because he was more valued. He was taken more seriously than a Hispanic with a disability. Or that was my perception, but it seemed to be a valid perception, because they would always address him first before they even looked at me. And then they realized that those things were for me, and their voice and their mannerisms and their attitude shifted. So I think that that level of discrimination or devaluement on my behalf really shaped the context of the work I'm putting forward now, and not just using intersectionality as a buzzword, but really including it in the messages, the policies, the material that I'm putting out towards the community.
Thank you, Andy. I can see you better now. Thank you so much. We're going to go on and ask Chaku to respond to the same question.
Great. Thank you, everyone. And Tawara and Andy, I appreciate your comments and presentation already. I especially appreciate the bringing together of the focus on culture, the person-centered practice, as well as this focus on multiple identities and intersectionality, because it's really been the way we've been trying to speak about these issues that affect us in our lives. And as for me, as a person who identifies with a variety of cultural identities, I'm Indian, as I said, I'm born in Kuwait. I'm a cisgendered male. I have a lot of different experiences as an immigrant. So, for example, I wasn't born here, but I came to the United States and naturalized as a citizen. So it's not just my experience as an individual, it's also my experience as a family. So my cultural identity as a family is not somewhat separate or as individualized as sometimes it's experienced. I identify as a person who's been disabled by mental health and substance use and trauma-related conditions. And that's a part of my narrative. I identify as a person who has a cultural identity of not having a degree. And so I'm not educated informally in the way that people, because of the experience of my disability interrupting my earlier development in that way. I'm a person with different language. I spoke a different language when I first came to this country, and had experiences in education that influenced my use of my language. So whether it's that or even the historical context within which I showed up in this country. So what was happening in Rochester, New York in 1972 was actually a factor in my understanding of who I am and what I am. So ultimately, when I think about what is culture, I loved all the frameworks that were presented. For me, what I end up experiencing is that culture is how I made meaning in the world, how I perceive and interpret the world, and what are the kinds of things that I conclude as a result. So that matched with my understanding of intersectionality, which for me is really about not just recognizing the multiple cultural identities, but recognizing the varying degrees to which my power, my privilege, my marginalization, and my sense of oppression really show up in each of these identities. And their relationship with each other is critical. If I'm working with somebody and I'm not aware of their immigration story and their perception or the meaning they've made out of their immigration story, it's not enough to just know that they are an immigrant, for example, or that someone is trans, or that sort of thing. What I need to know is the story behind it. And a lot of times that's hard to take the time for. I've worked with a lot of counselors who would have, the third question would be, what is your culture? And that's kind of like asking someone, there's a story of the two fish swimming along in the river, and a third fish comes up to them and says, hey boys, how's the water? And swims on. Well, one of the fish says to the other fish, what the heck is water? He doesn't even know what he's swimming in. And that's the way in which we ask about culture. We sometimes have this awkward way in which we ask people to talk about the very things that are actually influencing us on an everyday basis. So it gets a little complicated. The simplest way that I've found to do that is to ask people about what matters to them the most, which is different than what concerns us. Concerns are things like the barriers that we might put into a plan, right? My son is hearing voices, or he's struggling, he's using drugs, or that's the kind of thing they would ask my family, and that became what mattered to them, to the system. But to my family, if they asked what mattered, they would say, well, he's not going back to school, or he's not educated. We came to this country for him to have opportunity and to be self-sufficient. You've got him in a day program for a year, and you're telling us just to be happy he's not trying to kill himself or anyone else. That wasn't good enough for my family. The recommendations of a group home wasn't culturally congruent with what we would want. We didn't want to be separated as much as we were fighting and not getting along and not connecting. The ability to hear what really mattered to us, what concerned us, what our explanatory models were for what we were going through. I think, Tawara referred to that a little bit. I mean, how I even explained my experience was not from an illness perspective. My parents come from, and my family comes from, a deep heritage of Ayurveda. So we look at our experiences very differently. And that was not heard at all. So to even hear that when my parents said, no, he's not sick, he just doesn't connect with how powerful he is. He's, flipping tables because he's trying to be heard. You're not listening to him, that kind of thing. They were trying to help people understand, but instead people were getting scared. So I think this idea that organizations and cultures, at the very end of the day, my very presence was countercultural. And that was difficult. So my reactions to that countercultural and everything, whether it's the racism or xenophobia or, whatever it was that was coming at me, my reactions were being pathologized and, by the system. So the ability to hear that and see that and value that, or even just to recognize trauma in that way, was part of what we were getting at. So anyway, Tawara, I don't want to take too much time. I hope that was helpful and built on what you and Andy just spoke to. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Chaco. I think it was really very powerful, and thank you for sharing such intimate aspects of your life experience. We're going to move on just quickly to look at cultural diversity and different worldviews, and we're going to come back and hear from Andy and Chaco again. again, we hear the term cultural diversity a lot. I thought that we'd offer a way to think about cultural diversity again, with the emphasis on that we are all cultural, we're all cultural beings. And so as we think about culture being able to describe differences by race or ethnicity, and self-identification, which is really very important, tribal or clan affiliation, gender identity, as we talked about before, socioeconomic status, physical intellectual abilities. These are all factors that distinguish one group from another. So as you think about that broad definition and the great degree of diversity, cultural diversity we have within the country, I want you to just really think about who are the people in need of person-centered thinking services and supports from your perspective, and what are the current and emerging demographic trends in your state, territory, and or within tribal nations, because they're very related. Oftentimes, we are seeing a set of people. They may or may not be individuals and populations that are in the greatest need of services. So quickly, we know that when we look at projections, and this is things for you to think about going forward within your respective organizations and programs, that the United States is becoming more and more racially diverse. This is not a new pattern. We also know from the census predictions, which a new one will be coming up soon, that the U.S. is projected to be a plurality nation, and that while the non-Hispanic white population is still the largest, there will be no race or ethnic group that is projected to have greater than 50% of the nation's total in 2044. Now, that may seem a long distance off, but it really isn't. And then when we look at, again, who are Americans, who live in America, more than half are projected to belong to a minority group, any other group than non-Hispanic white alone, and that the nation is projected to be majority minority in 2045. I'm not big on the term majority minority, because only in America could a majority still be referred to as minority. That's an editorial comment, but needed to be able to get it on the table. We know that in some states, such as California, in New Mexico, and in Texas, that the child population has already reached that majority minority status. I thought these are other things for you to think about in terms of really understanding and digging into culture. As the fastest growing racial ethnic group in the US are individuals who self-identify as having two or more races. And they, again, are projected to grow. And so as you think about this whole notion of people who self-identify as having two or more races, I want you to think about the forms that you currently have. And people have to check a box. They're checking Black or African American or Latino or Hispanic. In Asia, they're checking all these boxes. Many people don't feel that they're confined to those two boxes. It doesn't tell the story in terms of who they are. And so it's important to really think about how people self-identify, and do we have ways in which we're able to capture those identities in an effective manner. So again, as we look at the population, this is most recent data, is 2017. 2018 data has not been released yet. Generally, it's toward August or so that we see those data. And so if we look at the percentages of people in the United States, again, non-Hispanic whites are at 72.3%, African Americans are at 12.7%, and the other percentages that you see there. Hispanic or Latino, based on how we define a group identity in this country, Hispanic is considered an ethnicity, as could many other groups. So this is how data are collected. And they can be of any race. And so that we see 18.1% of people during this ACL estimate indeed self-identified as Latino and Hispanic. What's important, before when we talked about individuals who may self-identify as having two or more races or ethnic identities, these are just some categories that have been available on the U.S. Census in terms of how people self-identify as white and Black or African American, or Black and African American and Asian, or American Indian and Alaska Native and Asian, so that there are all of these categories, including those who may self-identify as three or more races. So I think as we take this into consideration. What does this mean for person-centered thinking, planning, and practice? As we look at the linguistic diversity in this country, you can see how many people speak a language other than English at home. That's 21.8%, which is significant. Then we also see the language categories, those who speak Spanish, Indo-European languages, of which there are quite a few, Asian and Pacific Island languages, and other languages that indeed are listed there. Now, this is the US. However, when we do work in each state, we look at what does this look like at a state level, and those percentages look very, very different depending on what area of the country that you may be in. Another term that's really very important is the concept of limited English-speaking households. It used to be referred to as linguistic isolation. And as you look at limited English-speaking households in 2017, it indicates that 4.4% of households, and again, this is an estimate, could indeed be more. You could also see them by category. What's interesting is that the Asian and Pacific Island languages exceeds Spanish speaking in terms of what it means to live in a limited English-speaking household. And those are households where no one over age 14 speaks only English, or also speaks a non-English language and also English very well. This has significant implications for planning services, for the design of services, for resource allocation, if we're meeting the needs of the whole person, as it relates to person-centered thinking, person-centered planning, and person-centered practice. All right, and I would like to ask, how familiar are you with the languages that are spoken in your state and geographic locale, also the racial ethnic makeup, and how closely does your service population of people that you're serving match the demographics according to data either collected by census or within the state? Something to consider. So these are cultural factors that influence diversity. We certainly aren't going to go through all of these. They're all really very important. I would like to highlight one: cultural, racial, and ethnic identity. Many times people look at these terms, they may use them interchangeably. They are very different. And I always tell the same story about a colleague, James Mason, who was doing training in a group, and that was one person there was a person of color. And as he spoke about African-American issues, he kind of looked over and glanced at this person. On break, she came up to him and said, "Hey, Dr. Mason, I appreciate the personal attention you're giving me today, but I'm Panamanian, and I mean it." And our colleague and good friend had made a mistake. He'd made an assumption. Just because this person was Black, he assumed that the person was African-American. So if you can think about Panama, totally different country of origin, totally different language. She self-identified as Latina. And so that as we think about these concepts, including when we looked at the iceberg, cultural, racial, and ethnic identity are interrelated, but they are not the same thing. And so these are numerous cultural factors, including how people, what their belief systems are about what it means to have a disability, what it means to have mental health needs. What does it mean in terms of aging? In certain cultures, when you age, you are revered, that you're sought out for wisdom. That may or may not be the experience of people in this country in terms of those who are aging. And so really paying attention to these various factors as you think about person-centered thinking, person-centered planning, and person-centered practice. Again, these are external factors that really are key and critical. Just because of time, I don't think that we have time to really go into them. But there are things that one needs to pay attention to. Groups of people who live in the United States experience discrimination. They experience discrimination in healthcare, in mental health care, and an array of social services. Understanding what the impact of that discrimination is based on their well-being, their emotional well-being and their health is key and critical. And the extent to which you're able to address that, elicit information about the experience of discrimination is very, very important in terms of the populations that you're serving. Again, culture impacts a range of things. There are superstitions, there's beliefs about what it means, again, to have illness, mental health. It's important to understand those. Chaco gave us an explanation of an Indian belief in terms of Ayurvedic medicine. It's important to know these belief systems and to be comfortable in asking so that people don't feel judged or uncomfortable in terms of sharing that with you. Again, we have many barriers in accessing services and support, and they range from historical mistrust of healthcare, mental health care, education, and social service professionals, to experiences of racism, oppression, ableism, sexism, homophobia, religious phobias, discrimination, oppression, and bias, issues of stigma, issues of literacy and health literacy, and limited English proficiency, among others. It's important to know the extent to which your services are addressing these experiences, because you can't deal with the whole person in terms of person-centered thinking, practices, and planning if you are not familiar with these experiences among the populations that you serve. So as we think about person-centered as a concept and a practice, we can say that that is very Western, because the emphasis is on the individuals. And so as you think about, again, cultures, that there are some cultures who that are not sure why that moved, individualistic, and they tend to stress the needs of individuals over the needs of the group as a whole. And so these characteristics include individuals' rights, and they take center stage. Being dependent on others is frowned upon. The rights of the individual take a higher precedence. And so in terms of thinking about that and person-centered thinking, planning, and practice, it is very much from an individualistic point of view. Now, we may say, oh yes, we include the families. However, it is focused on the individual. There are other cultures, such as the collectivist cultures, that really emphasize the needs and goals of the group as a whole over the needs and desires of each individual. And these characteristics include people are encouraged to do what is best for society, working as a group and supporting others is essentials, families and communities have a central role. So as we think about the concept of person-centered thinking, planning, and practice, that it may not be a natural fit for some communities and for some people, because they are viewing it from a very different perspective, have a very different mental model or a different worldview. So I'm encouraging you to think about the individuals that reside in the US, territories, and tribal nations, whether or not they embrace individualism or collectivism or a combination of both. So have you or your organization explored these concepts with people to whom you provide services and support? And what are their implications for person-centered thinking, planning, and practice? And again, these aren't polling questions, they're just rhetorical, and hopefully these are things that you'll talk about within your programs going forward. Common values in independent living and recovery movements. As we think about this, we have common values. Those are self-advocacy, self-determination, and again, emphasis on self, equality, independence, productivity, and inclusion. And I do ask, do these values have the same meaning across all cultural groups? Something for us to consider. Again, we are very much looking at independence and what the individual does. How does that resonate with other groups and other cultures? So rule number 2, the value systems that underpin many services and supports may neither be shared, accepted, nor similarly expressed by all cultural groups to whom we all provide services and supports. So we're going to hear from Andy and Chaku again. Chaku, I'm going to ask that you go first, or maybe Andy, just because I'm not clear on your takeoff time from the airport. So why don't we go with you first, Andy? And I want you to really share with the audience, individually or from organizations with which you are affiliated, about cultural beliefs and practices or barriers related to disability or mental health or behavioral health services. And then, again, please share any of your thoughts on cultural diversity and different worldviews.
So I think the disability community, and I'm going to shake some feathers here, which I usually do, so no offense to anyone, but when we think of disability now, our services are really in the context of a Caucasian framework. And I say that gently, but I say it earnestly because growing up as a Hispanic male in this systemic system, I had no cultural awareness of my upbringing. I grew up in systemic poverty and I grew up in foster care. So I grew up surrounded by Caucasian families who allowed me to share their experience, but I was not able to learn or understand my Hispanic heritage. And I think systemically, I'm a little older now, but I still see a very Caucasian lens on the services that we provide individuals with disabilities. All the leaders in the disability movement from the 80s and beyond are predominantly Caucasian. So I'm looking at this work in my experience now coming in and saying, again, not only are we developing language or material in different languages, but are we acknowledging that Hispanic youth and individuals in Hispanic cultures look at disability very differently? Some of them have very deep-seated roots in Catholicism or other faiths that need to be addressed. And are we looking at that and bringing in the faith communities? I don't see that yet done on a larger scale. So I think there's a lot of work to be done in these spaces because I still feel that in order to be heard in a room, I have to go at it through a Caucasian context. And I'm so glad that Tawara, you brought this up because I don't think that in our work, we don't consciously do it. It's a subconscious attitudinal barrier that we have that's just sort of there. But I think we need to be aware of when we provide these services and supports that it's not from our experience, it's from an individual's experience. And I think a lot of what we see currently and definitely previously is not up to that par. It's a barrier that we must address, and it's steps. It's not gonna. There's no magic swipe of how we solve this issue. We just have to systemically move forward as much as possible to do it.
Thank you, Andy. Jaco, can you give your perspectives, please? Did you, I think you need to unmute yourself.
Oh, I'm sorry. I had both. I had two mutes on, the video and this one. So I was saying that I think I'd like to start systemically and then kind of drill it down to individual perspective. But, you know, clearly as a system in a variety of different systems, we have struggled to really implement anything close to being person-centered, especially from a cultural perspective. We have models that are getting there. I mean, self-direction and other models that are really allowed. Funding can be an example of that. However, you know, we see, you know, the majority of people who are forced into care are people of color. Example, African American, Spanish-speaking Latino communities are the ones that are in the most restrictive cares, especially in mental health and substance use. So I think these examples, or who's getting referred on to employment, or who's being seen as capable of working, or, you know, being, you know, these, you know, if you go to a locked ward and anywhere in the country, that's young Black men that are, you know, very, very much caught up in a system that has done a number of things to contribute from a social determinants perspective. So I think that experience alone, being able to personally be able to talk about it. And I mentioned being countercultural. It wasn't just, by the way, to the systems. I was countercultural in my perspective to my own family, to the norms of my own family, to my culture as an Indian. I was challenging caste. I was challenging our religiosity. I was challenging sexuality norms. I was challenging hostilities. There were a number of things that people would have rather kept me quiet about, you know, and I didn't know how to communicate. So getting to this point of how do we go from an individualistic framework that might be even driven by more of a Caucasian or white, you know, privileged environment, you know, to a collective one. One of those for me and my family was to start listening to the various perspectives of each member and really including and even financing a whole family approach. We need to get to a place where we're actually not systemically oriented to just an individual, but to the systems that person might be needing to engage. So those are just some initial thoughts, but I think for me personally, the issue of rights is an example of something that is cross-cultural, but maybe interpreted differently. The role of the person and family being able to even inform care in many cultures, including my own, is seen as a difficult place to start, even being seen as an expert of my own, know the doctors who I'm supposed to listen to, that sort of stuff. And then finally, linguistically, being able to even provide a linguistically comfortable environment that allows me to speak freely and for my family to speak freely about what's happening. So we have a long way to go, I think is what I'm trying to say. I think we've made some good progress. We've set up some good frameworks for it. But I think we have to really help people stay and share their cultural formulation for themselves much more effectively. That's it, thanks.
Thank you, both of you. So let's maybe summarize some of the things that we've heard. And we want to have some time to be able to get to the questions and or things that you've been entering in chat. So as we look at what we've shared today, from demographic trends to cultural beliefs and practices, to the evolution of person-centered thinking, these are some thoughts I'd like to share with you. In the whole arena of person-centered thinking, it's important to consider it really isn't just about the culture of the person receiving services and supports. It's not even just about the person receiving services and supports and their families. It is also very much about who the person is that's delivering services and supports, so that this whole notion of person-centered thinking can't be one way. Again, we all see things through our own cultural lens. This is indeed the worldview. We bring those worldviews to the work that we do. And so that just as we had that mirror in the earlier slide in terms of looking at things from one perspective, we have to be able to look at it from multiple perspectives. And we are part of this equation. It's what we bring. So I chose this, this little slide that talked about the same old thinking gives us the same old results. So even if it is person-centered thinking, if it's person-centered thinking from one viewpoint, is it really meeting the cultural and linguistic needs of the populations? Again, let's look at person-centered planning. It's about having knowledge and the willingness to really look at those multiple cultural dimensions that we talked about, looking at the multiple dimensions of culture and how they play out in the planning process from beginning to the end. It's also about revisiting and revising tools. There are a lot of tools that have been created. When I look through the literature, all kinds of tools, all kinds of models that have been created around person-centered planning. So I ask that you really look at those tools and to see whether or not those tools really do a good job of capturing culture in the way that we have discussed today. So again, looking at those tools, are they as relevant as we want them to be? Are they a one-size-fits-all? And we have to consider goodness of fit. And then we look at person-centered practice. And this is really ensuring that the values and the structures and the practices and attitudes and behaviors of any organization with which you may be affiliated and the staff of that organization are aligned with principles and practices of cultural and linguistic competence. Because you simply can't be person-centered if you're not really addressing the culture and language of populations and groups. I'm going to say that one more time because I think it's very important. I know in a disability community, you know, we would hear a lot around, well, if it's person-centered, then we are addressing culture. That is an assumption. And obviously, these experiences of both Chaku and Andy tells us otherwise. So I really want you to think about this within the context of the work that you do. And quickly, these are some thoughts I want you to remember about culture. You are a cultural being, and you have multiple cultural identities, one of which may be your professional discipline, or your position in a school or university or a clinic or a community-based organization, or even a governmental or tribal entity. So again, you are a cultural being. You view and interpret the world through your own cultural lens, which is comprised of both individual and group experiences over time. So you didn't get to have your worldview on your own. It's things that have been embedded and immersed over time. Your cultural frame of reference may or may not be shared by the individuals to whom you provide care, services, and support. So again, as we looked at those values that underpin systems of independent living, systems of recovery, and other support, are they shared? Your worldview or cultural frame of reference influences your approach to delivering services and supports, or any other responsibility that you may have. And that your worldview is influenced by the culture of the organization with which you work or are employed. So that those is layers upon layers. The cultural frame of reference, your cultural frame of reference can contribute to biases. It's necessary to identify, acknowledge, and address biases if they interfere with your capacity to perform day-to-day responsibilities in a competent and respectful manner. And lastly, your willingness and capacity to address cultural misunderstandings are essential. They're essential to supporting individuals with disabilities, with behavior and mental health needs, and older adults and their families. They're essential to the working relationships that you have with colleagues and others involved in the array of systems that provide services and support to these diverse populations. All right, so I know you're wondering, why do I have Tina Turner? Unless you've heard me present before, why do you see Tina Turner on the screen? And what does she have to do at all with person-centered thinking, planning, and practice? So I'm old. I'm just going to put that out there. And back in the day, Tina Turner sang a song that was "What's Love Got to Do with It?" Now I said back in the day because my son would say way, 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 way back in the day when he wants to refer to the time in which I would say younger. So I want you to really think about this, and I want you to ask the question, what's culture got to do with it? And I bet if you ask that question and you answer it honestly, you will see so many ways in which culture influences person-centered thinking, person-centered practices, and person-centered planning. So in conclusion, it's not person-centered if culture is not fully embedded. So I will stop now, turn things back over to Alex and to Bevan. And I also thank really very much Chaku and Andy for sharing their experiences and their perspectives thus far. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Goode, Chaku, Andy. If the activity on chat is any indication, this discussion has been quite engaging, and so many exciting ideas and thoughts and questions have been raised. I'm fairly certain that our attendees have asked more questions than we'll have a chance to get to in the next 10 minutes. But let's try to get through a few, and then I've been compiling the rest of the questions and we'll work with our panelists to prepare some responses and post those up on the NCAPS website along with the recording and the PDF slides and a plain language summary of this webinar within 2 weeks. And the other thing I'll quickly say is that this is just one of 4 webinars that are focused on issues of culture and linguistic competency as they relate to person-centered thinking, planning, and practice. So never fear, we will be exploring and continuing to explore a lot of these topics with Professor Goode and others in the next 6 months or so. So the first question for you all is this. Does anyone on the panel think that time and all that will bring with it will, quote unquote, cure this issue?
Andy, you're on mute. Chaco, are you going to take that?
I would like to
Go ahead,
express.
Andy.
So I don't think it's time. I think it's people. I think we've waited a long time for things to change, and it's people, right? And time can only change our environment. It doesn't really affect culture or attitudinal barriers. I think that has to come with people, and people gaining an awareness of the things around them and understanding themselves and understanding people that think differently than they do.
Andy, you are breaking up, so I'm going to go to Chaco now.
I'll just say, I mean, I probably don't understand fully, maybe what time or what the person asking the question intended, but generally speaking, I would say that with time, there are some things that have improved, certainly, and that's, however, not able to be separated from all the things that create change, right? So senses of urgency and community involvement and people and all the things Andy just spoke to. So I don't think it's in and of itself is an indicator that we just wait around for it. I certainly think there's some work to be done.
All right. Alex, Bevan, another question?
Okay. Self-determination is being used a lot. How does self-determination differ or support person-centered thinking and planning and practice, particularly as it relates to culture?
All right. So as you think about the concept of self-determination, basically is saying that, everyone, I'm going to say inherently, biologically, has the right to determine what happens in their lives. And so I certainly do understand that from that perspective. However, what happens in their lives, what they prefer and need, will be culturally influenced. And I see that is a clear area in self-determination that sometimes has not really been acknowledged.
Okay. Would any other, Chaco or Andy, would you like to weigh in on this one?
Well, I'll just say very quickly that, without self-determination, I feel like person-centered practice will stay stuck. We need to emphasize self-determination, especially from a cultural perspective at a higher level. And systems tend to defer to more system-centered needs rather than self-determination, including rights. And I think that's going to become a factor quite a bit.
So an example of self-determination may be that I make a decision about what I want to do. However, I don't make that decision alone. I depend on others to help advise me, whether it's family, whether it's friends, whether it's someone within a faith community, so that that whole decision-making process as it relates to being, quote, self-determined. We also know that our systems of services and supports aren't set up in a way in which self-determination is the value. it might be articulated as a value, but certainly isn't a reality in terms of assistance and services and supports.
You know, someone asked also that self-determination was a Western value, and I just want to emphasize, you know, there are cultures like mine that are thousands and thousands, you know, of years of self-determination being stripped from cultures and in order to oppress. So I think that's something we want to consider as well from Indigenous communities.
Thanks all. Here's another one. This comes from a person who's working in a center that serves people with special needs, and is wondering how to change the mindset of colleagues who are treating everyone equally as far as the services they receive.
Chucko, do you want to weigh in? I respect from you, and I'm not sure, it looks like Andy has signed off. Do you want to weigh in?
Well, I'd love to hear your response. I know you have one.
Okay, I think that there's so much about equal, and I know that you've seen all of these images and graphs that looks at equity and equality, and that they're not the same. So that treating someone equally may be unintentionally oppressive to another group, because what they need may not be in equal increment. So in other words, if I have a great deal of difficulty with communication, I need a lot of help in communication, but I may not need a lot of help in mobility. Would I treat that person the same as another person? I think that you'd have to look at when it's appropriate to look at equal versus when it's appropriate to give people what they need and the doses that they need, and what they may require in order to thrive in our society.
Perfect.
Ditto, right? All right, I'm gonna kind of squish two questions together, and I think one is leads into another. One person was just asking on chat, you know, can you provide examples of a collectivist culture in the U.S.? So as you answer this next question, maybe note examples of collectivist cultures in the United States. And the larger question is, you know, as person-centered approaches are as you know, as we've discussed, relatively individualistic in their framing, at least as we use them now. How can we adjust our person-centered approaches to support people who come from a more collectivist culture? And also, how do we accommodate the family unit without neglecting the individual's needs and wants? I realize this is a huge question and probably deserves its own webinar, but let's give a teaser for some of the webinars to come.
I heard three distinct questions, and I was trying to concentrate on one, and then you entered another one and then another one. Can you go back to the first one first, please?
Sure. Sorry for that. The first is simply, can you give an example of a collectivist culture in the U.S.?
All right. So I'm not going to name a particular, quote, cultural community. However, there are a number of cultures and cultural practices in the U.S. where the family is the unit of intervention, that everything is around the family, and that would include people who may have mental health needs or disabilities and those who are aging, and that the family is involved in all decision making, that it's not ever about solely the individual. I'll give you an example. I used to do developmental screening and assessment here at Georgetown a number of years ago when I first came. And I had only seen mother and father for this particular child when we were doing the assessments. And then they were coming back for their, like for us to share the results. And so I walked into the clinic area and I said, gee, it's crowded today. And then I realized that the 8 people who were there, and I'd only reserved room enough for a few people, were all from this child's family. And it included relatives. It included a neighbor who provided childcare. That was all about what was going to happen to that particular child. And that is the way they approached care and services for this particular child. So again, I'm not going to say, oh, this community, this particular racial group or that racial group is collectivist. I think you'd have to look at what is the behavior of any given community, any given person or family, any given population. Chaco, you want to weigh in? You go with that? You're on mute again.
Saying that was great. I don't think I need to add anymore.
Can I squeeze in one more question and then we will wrap up? And so this is more of a quickie. And again, I think we'll have some future webinars, tools, and resources focused on this question. It's a question that we love at NCAPS. And that's, where did it go? Well, anyway, it's a question related to measuring. Any measures that you could point us to that get at some of these questions around cultural competency and adequately addressing culture.
And particularly how an organization can measure itself.
How an organization can monitor its own responsiveness to culture.
Okay, so we get these questions a lot. I would say when you look at the evolving field and emergent field of cultural competence, that there are some measures. I think what's important is that the measures that we have seen are unique to particular fields. And so when you think about mental health, there are clearly measures. When you think about disability, not so much, because we have a focus on that a lot. And I'm not as familiar in terms of aging, so that there are measures. I think what's important is measuring what and toward what end. And that's an important question to reflect upon. That we get a lot of calls say, oh, I want to do a cultural competence assessment. And I'm going to say, for what? What are you trying to learn? Are you trying to learn whether or not within your organization what training people need? Are you trying to determine the extent to which your colleges support cultural and linguistic competence? And so I don't think it's an easy reference for that. And we can share this with you later. We just did a webinar on this topic looking at measures for cultural and linguistic competence, and it was very well received. So I will make sure that you get that link and you're able to share that with them. And last, there are not a lot of validated measures because many within, especially the disability community, to some extent mental health community, have not invested the resources to really look at this from an individual level and or from an organizational level. We do have some tools.
I just wanted to add, really appreciated the point around what to measure. And one of the measures that I think across systems that we've really struggled with, especially when it comes down to inequities and disparities and the focus on equity, is engagement. So, having communities define what does engagement mean, what does it look like to be engaged. Some people equate engagement with compliance, and they're just not intended to be the same thing. And so what you're considering access or engagement may not be culturally what a group is actually indicating that when they feel engaged. So let's just maybe consider the pursuit of measures from a person-centered context as well.
That's a really important point as well. Thank you. We are getting very close to the end of the webinar, and I do want to particularly right now thank you, and we're very grateful that we're able to share this conversation. We are going to pull up a few real-time evaluation questions, and we do hope that our participants will take the last few moments to respond to the polls when they are pulled up. Sabrina, when you have a moment, if you can bring up our first evaluation questions. As with the earlier polling, you do need to scroll down, and we really appreciate everybody taking about a few more seconds to scroll through this. As you're finishing up with the polling, I am going to say this, as Bevan mentioned, this is the first of a 4-part series specifically focused on the role of cultural and linguistic competence and as it relates to person-centered thinking, planning, and practice. We're really looking forward to these upcoming webinars, and you can find the dates for those on the ncaps.acl.gov website. Our next webinar, actually, and we just are giving you a little bit of a heads up, is going to be on August 12th, specifically focusing on brain injury. Here at NCAPS, we're committed to the notion that real progress comes from the collective voice and work of all people in our community. And we hope that we've been able to exemplify some of that work here by bringing the knowledge and expertise of our 3 panelists, Chaku, Tawara, and Andy all together. Please keep in touch. We look forward to hearing from you, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks all. We'll leave the polling questions up for another moment or two if you'd like to take your time with those. And also, if you have other suggestions or ideas that don't fit in the boxes that we presented with the polling questions, you're welcome to send us a note as well.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks, Taku, Tawara, and Andy.
Bye.
Bye-bye. And we will ask Sabrina to close the webinar, or yep, we can end the webinar when you're ready, Sabrina.
Whenever the questions slow down coming in. Give people a moment.